Yeah, I mean, and just adding to some of what the president said, and Garrett, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a long post. He says about Zelenskyy, a dictator without elections. Zelenskyy better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. In the meantime, we are successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia. Senator Heitkamp, this is, and, Garrett was talking about, this has kind of been on the increase in the last couple of days, but these last 24 hours, it seems as though President Trump is, drawing a line against Zelenskyy.
Well, he's definitely ratcheting up the rhetoric. The question is whether that rhetoric is bluster or whether it's for real. Let's admit it. This relationship has not been good from the very beginning when Zelenskyy refused to play ball on the Biden investigation. And so, Donald Trump is somewhat on a revenge tour. Let's just all admit that. And so has very little or no respect for someone who has really led his country and been the moral fiber of his country for the last 4 years. I think the real question is, when does Congress engage? When do they step back and say, we're all with Ukraine, you need to step back, we need to be standing with our allies in Europe, and we need to be standing with Ukraine and Western democracy? And I don't think that's going to happen. So let's see how that plays out up on the Hill.
Yeah, I mean, Senator, foreign policy is a purview of the executive. And in this case, this is, this conversation that's going on in Riyadh yesterday between the United States, Saudi Arabia and Russia, at which Ukraine wasn't even invited to participate in. And that Zelenskyy later said he was not going to be going to Riyadh for at least the next month. It just seems as though, Senator, I just don't know what Congress's role could be on this.
Well, I mean, you have the power of the purse. And certainly there was broad support for providing assistance and help for Ukraine. And I think that Zelenskyy understands that may not be forthcoming given the president's willingness to basically ignore appropriations. And so the question now becomes, what does Europe do? And I think the wake-up call came last week at the Munich conference. We'll see if Europe is willing to stand with Zelenskyy and Western democracy. And I think Trump cannot negotiate this alone without, if Europe stands up, he can't negotiate it alone without Europe and without Ukraine.
Carlos, I mean, no doubt Congress has the power of the purse, but in this case, how do you see this?
Well, Jose, I agree with Senator Heitkamp that this could put a strain on the president's relationship with congressional Republicans. There are bipartisan majorities in both houses that support Ukraine. And while certainly the executive conducts foreign policy, Congress funds it. And in the Senate, 4 Republicans get together and they have leverage. In the House, 2 Republicans can get together right now, and they have leverage. The president has a very aggressive, ambitious agenda for the Republican Congress. So some of these members can stand up and say, hold on a second, if we're going to do all of this, we need your cooperation here. We want you to be perhaps a little more supportive of Ukraine. Of course, the great irony in what you read, Jose, is that the dictator in all of this is Vladimir Putin, who hasn't held legitimate elections in a very long time.
Yeah, and I'm just, going forward, and to the senator's point, Carlos, where the responsibility of Congress, and we just established that, but then Europe, which is, I guess, looks like it's being sidelined every day. This conference that they had in Paris, it really didn't get to much. Is there a new axis of influence in the world led by the United States, including Russia and excluding Europe?
There's clearly a massive disruption going on, Jose. But again, the role of Congress is important. Right now, there are congressional delegations at NATO in Belgium trying to figure all of this out and sending a bipartisan message to our European allies that at least Congress is still standing with them in this whole conflict.
Yeah, I haven't seen him standing on any of this, but, maybe it could happen, maybe not. But, Garrett, let's go back to the whole Doge issue, if we could. The Washington Post is reporting firings at the Department of Defense are expected to start soon. What other cuts are we expecting going forward?
Well, Jose, the president and Elon Musk have both teased the idea that they need to get under the hood at the Pentagon over the last several weeks. That's where the bulk of what's called discretionary federal spending takes place, essentially everything that's not already locked up in entitlements or interest rates on debt. About 14% overall of federal spending is at the Pentagon. We could continue to see other staff cuts there, although obviously the majority of Pentagon employees are uniformed folks, not civilians. You can't go around firing master sergeants the same way you could lay off probationary staffers at other agencies. But there are certainly contracts that could potentially be canceled at the Pentagon. Elon Musk, for example, has been a huge critic of manned fighter jets, something that Congress and the Pentagon have spent an enormous amount of money on in the past. So I suspect we'll start to hear more rumblings of DOJ staffers inside the Pentagon. Likewise, we're also hearing from other agencies who are starting to fire and lay off people beyond just these so-called probationary employees. Department of Homeland Security, for example, my colleague Julia Ainsley reported, citing two sources, is going to lay off hundreds of senior level officials who the Trump administration believes are not in line with their priorities on issues like immigration. So expect to see these firings continue for the short term here, especially after this federal district court judge ruled yesterday that the DOJ, or at least the federal government, has the authority to continue making these cuts for now.
You know, and Senator, as we hear more and more cuts, we're also hearing stories of some federal workers who are being impacted by these cuts. One of them did not want to show his face on camera, but take a listen to some of these comments.
I am here in this job because I care about the results. I actually get to work on things that make people's lives better. That's a dream come true for me.
My supervisor had sent me a text message saying that she was CC'd on the email from the upper administration that said I had been terminated. I loved, having discussions about the value of these places.
We don't have any skin in this game other than public service. Our nation's wildfire response system transcends politics because wildfire transcends politics.
Heidi, all those people we just heard from live outside the Washington, D.C. area. These cuts are having an impact throughout our country.
Well, without a doubt, just in my state alone, they're laying off FSA, Farm Service Agency workers right before the spring planting. And, that may not be that popular. And so, what's interesting is they talk about probationary employees, but if you move to another level, you're on probation in that job. So a lot of these employees are very senior. And I will tell you, when I was in the Senate, I served on the committee that dealt with federal workforce. Guess what we were worried about? The quality of the federal workforce and whether we could recruit great federal workers. What do you think is happening right now for any young person who is looking at this, who may have skills that we desperately need in public service? It really is the decimation of the reputation of public service, and that's going to have ramifications long beyond this administration.
Carlos, the radical transformation of the federal government was one of the key components of then candidate Trump during the whole campaign. How is the implementation of that promise being seen throughout the country?
Well, Jose, I think politically, the White House still has a lot of public support for what they're doing. This idea of shaking up the federal bureaucracy, the idea that the federal bureaucracy is bloated and inefficient, that has really taken root in our country, and in part with good reason. Sometimes people get frustrated dealing with the federal government. We've seen plenty examples of inefficiency, of waste, fraud, and abuse. So I think for now, the president still has the public behind him on this front. What could change it? The human stories. I mean, you watch those stories and they really do touch your heart. And then if something breaks, right? Let's say something happens at the FAA, food inspections, our nuclear program. There are federal employees that are being fired who work on these issues. So if something happens to break, then that could blunt the administration's momentum. But for now, I really do think the public is behind this idea of transforming the federal government.
And Garrett, just last night, Elon Musk was asked about potential conflicts of interest in this new role. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I mean, I haven't asked the president for anything ever.
And if it comes up, how will you handle it?
Well,
you won't be involved.
Yeah, I'll recuse myself if it is.
If there's a conflict, you won't be involved. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want that, and he won't want it.
So Garrett, Musk says that he'll recuse himself if there's a conflict of interest. But with the responsibility falling on the president, how do we know if there was ever a conflict of interest?
We don't, Jose, and this is the problem here. I mean, this is a system entirely based on the honor system between these two men, the way they've described it, that Musk would come to the president or that the president would disqualify Musk on anything where there's a conflict of interest. And I think we can already, reasonably assume that there are conflicts, at least in the spaces in which he's operating. SpaceX, for example, his rocket company, has enormous contracts with the Pentagon, with NASA, with the federal government. His automobile company, Tesla, works with the Department of Transportation, is subject to, various lawsuits and regulations. I mean, he has enormous amounts of business in front of the federal government, and I think it's just a question of how he defines a conflict is essentially what we're waiting on for him or President Trump to tell us that there was one. There is no transparency in that regard beyond what they choose to offer when it comes to conflicts of interest.
And Carlos, if these cuts continue, I mean, do you think and you kind of mentioned it, but if these cuts continue, do you think there will be a line in the American public's perception of cost-benefit analysis going towards cost?
Yeah, look, at some point, any effort like this can go too far, and that's really when the public starts pushing back. Again, the human stories matter. I think people want to see these federal workers treated fairly, and also, the goals and the tasks of the federal government are important. I mean, there's the nuclear arsenal there. I mean, the federal government does so many things to keep us safe and to keep the country running every day that if there's a breakdown and they can point to this DOGE effort as being responsible for it, that could really have a negative effect.
I thank you so very much, Carlos Curbelo, Heidi Heitkamp, and Garrett Haake. Thank you very much for being with us this morning.